Hey everybody, welcome back to New Videos channel, and today we look into using your custom $fetch API even more efficient in Nuxt.js. Here we go. It is quite a common pattern in Nuxt applications to have a custom $fetch instance that has your own setup. For example, the base URL to your external API, some headers you have to pass in, or even interceptors to deal with authentication for zero codes, and so on and so on. But using that $fetch instance might be even easier than you do it right now, and maybe even easier than you thought. So let's have a look into a demo application and see how we can do that with composables a bit nicer. As usual, we start with an almost empty Nuxt project here on Nuxt 4 with the app folder. We have our Nuxt config with nothing inside. The only thing I've prepared already is this API Nuxt plugin where we just create our custom $fetch instance. And here, as an example, I set the base URL. Right? This might be familiar from my repository pattern video where I basically did the same. Of course, you can also make sure to read it here from your runtime config. That's all up to you. And if we now have a look into our index.view that is empty besides the shell, let's create a way to fetch some data. So commonly what we do is we say like, okay, let's just use useAsyncData here and have a key. So let's say, I don't know, users. And then we have some kind of async fetch function. So we make this whole thing async, and eventually we say return $fetch with /users, for example. And then we can render the data here in this div as example. Of course, now we don't use the custom $fetch, but the normal instance, and we want to change this. So let's take a look at the pattern that's quite common here. And that would be to get our Nuxt application by saying const Nuxt app equals use Nuxt app. And then we can either destructure that, or in this case, we can just say, let's get $API. And of course, this $API eventually comes from our plugin here where we've defined that and make sure it has all custom information. Now, instead of using $fetch here, we can just set $API and we're good to go. Now, things should work as expected. But this still looks like a lot of code. Well, at least one more line than necessary. And if you have a repository pattern, then maybe some more, etc., etc. So here's a little shorthand for that, especially if you use a Nitro endpoint and not an external API. So if we just imagine, let's do this real quick. We have a server API endpoint that says ping.ts. Here we go. And we want to create a Nitro event handler that just returns message pong. Okay, so far so good. So let's call it API endpoint, and for doing that, we want to use commonly a useFetch because we get this wonderful autocomplete. Of course, we could have said like instead of useFetch, we could take our API here and just write down /API ping. Of course, that will work as well, but this looks a bit more like we can use a useFetch here to do the same thing. We have the end-to-end autocomplete and we're good. But now we have the problem that we don't really use our custom fetch instance. So do we have to switch back to async data? No, of course not. Otherwise, I wouldn't show it here, right? Let's see how we can make it happen just with a very simple useFetch. The solution here is the options object at the very end, because here we can pass our body, we can set up method, params, etc. And while this will get even more type safe and get other improvements in the future as well, right now we have one thing that people do not use. And this is the $fetch parameter. And actually, this expects a fetch instance. So here we can pass our $API instance right into that, and we get all the defaults we set from our plugin here, like the base URL and headers, etc., etc. And of course, now if you want to, you could take this and put it in a custom composable, put it in some other places, so you don't have to repeat that code all the time. But you don't have to always define your, let's say, headers here in your useFetch or then use useAsyncData. You can just say, hey, I define my custom values in this one big fetch instance. I shared it with my whole application, or multiple if you have multiple applications you want to take a look at, right? And multiple APIs you want to call, external apps. And then I just pass that into useFetch and you're good to go. And this is all you need to do, which makes it a little bit easier. So in case you haven't tried it, or maybe, oh yeah, some headers here, and when I call some composables there, that might be a really good way to just have everything centralized. And very important, you sometimes just want to use the API instance, like $API, and then send a post request. You don't necessarily want to do it in your useFetch, one of the most common mistakes. So setting in the headers twice or in different places is always a bit meh. Anyway, this is the shortcut. I'm curious, did you ever use the $fetch parameter there? If you have other use cases, please drop them in the comments below. And other than that, see you in the next video. and happy hacking.